All right, great. Hey, everyone, how's it going? Thanks for being here. Welcome to Hack NYC. I didn't know whether to dress for Hack or dress for NYC, and I went for NYC, and I think that was the losing proposition. So thanks so much for being here. I'm Jason Healey, Senior Research Scholar with Columbia University, and we're here to talk for somewhere between the next half hour and the entire afternoon on the results of the New York Cyber Task Force, which reported out last year, and we've been having some great strides in getting the recommendations implemented, and so we're going to be talking about that with two of the members of the New York Cyber Task Force, Phil Venables of Goldman Sachs and Katheryn Rosen, also with Columbia University. And first, maybe we can just do some quick introductions, and Katheryn and then Phil, and then we'll jump in with some questions.
Sure. Hi, is this working? Fabulous. I'm Katheryn Rosen. I am a Senior Research Scholar at Columbia, as well as a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, and come to the cybersecurity conversation originally with my government service in the Obama administration at the Department of Treasury, in seat when the DDoS attacks started happening in 2012. Learned from my financial regulatory world very quickly about cybersecurity, and we'll talk a bit about some of the areas which I think have been really, really effective from the regulatory standpoint and some of the headwinds that we're facing.
Okay. Hi, Phil Venables. I'm at Goldman Sachs. My current role is I'm Chief Risk Officer for all of our operational and enterprise risks. At the time of the report, though, I was Head of Tech Risk and Chief Information Security Officer, a role that I had for 17 years before moving into this enterprise risk role.
Really, 17?
17.
Wow, my gosh. All right, so where does the time go? I've got a few copies of the New York Cyber Task Force brochure. It was a larger report, but we did it just a 4-pager. And what we came in and saying, so much of our jobs on the blue side, on the defensive side, we went back and said, boy, over time, you look back decades, you can see quotes from the 70s saying the attacker has the easier time and tends to get through, that defense has a harder time. That's not always true, but it really struck us to say, all right, well, we've got to change that, right? We've got to help make it so that cyberspace is more defendable, so that the defender starts getting the advantage. And we seized on a concept that seems obvious. We said we need leverage. The innovations that we pursue has to give the defender the greatest advantage over the attacker at the greatest scale and least cost. Now, we dove in, and to me, it was my favorite part of the report, and it's the center of the report, and it's the center of the brochure, is we said we look back over 50 years to say across technology, operations, and policy, within the enterprise and across cyberspace as a whole, what have been the innovations that have given us that greatest leverage? And so we really tried to take that through and say, okay, based on those past innovations, what lessons can we draw? And how does that help us think about what we need to be doing differently at cybersecurity? And so, Phil, maybe we can start with you on this. So you were one of the co-chairs on the report, and so walk us through some of your thoughts.
Yeah, so one of the main things we started looking at was to really start challenging some of the myths. And one of the myths we looked at, or potential myths, was the notion that attackers inherently will always have an advantage, and to see if there's any way we could actually challenge that. And so some of the things that we've talked about in the report and in other venues are things like the notion that attackers have bosses and budgets too. And so the notion that attackers have infinite resources is not necessarily true. In many respects, whether it's nation state, organized criminals, or other types of attackers, they do have specific objectives. They have finite resources. They have a goal. And they work under performance objectives. And the consequences of not meeting that are different depending on the threat actor. But interestingly, if you can adjust your environment to make it harder for an attacker, it's not always necessarily the case that they will keep coming back. Now, some of them will, and so this is not a panacea for all things. The second thing, which is interesting, we're here at Microsoft, because I know, I think it's John Lambert and some of the Microsoft threat guys have spoken about this, is the notion that defenders have to be right all the time and attackers only have to be right once. Again, you can flip that around and think about it. So when you look at the attack life cycle from infiltration to exfiltration, or other action on objective, you can look at a different perspective that says the attacker has to be right every step of the way to stay hidden, not detected, and not ejected, whereas a defender only has to catch them at least once and respond to that. So one of the things that we have to think about is just challenging some of these assumptions, seeing how we can go after that to adjust the economics of the attacker, to tilt the advantage in our favor by leveraging the fact that we can apply processes and technologies at scale using various different types of technology that we'll talk about as we go through this panel and process, and tilt things back to our favor. Again, not always going to be a panacea against the most determined attackers, but it's certainly worth thinking that we can keep tilting it back in our favor using the tools that are increasingly at our disposal.
And I'm going to come back to you in a second. My next question will be on which of the innovations do you think were giving us most leverage? But because you mentioned Microsoft, I'll cover one that came up a lot. Most of the time we think about cybersecurity innovations, we think about those that are up here in the box that is technology within the enterprise, right? That's your firewalls, your IDSs, the things that most of us are used to in our day jobs of trying to protect an enterprise. But we found we tended to get much more leverage in those that were technology, but working across cyberspace as a whole. And when we were asking experts this question, like what's given leverage, again and again, we had the answer of Windows Update. It wasn't cheap or easy for Microsoft in the 90s to do automated updates. But when it was done, it helped everybody all at once. Even if we could invent a perfect device or software technology in the enterprise, we've got to buy it and deploy it perfectly 1 billion times. Those that affect cyberspace as a whole, like Windows Update or end-to-end encryption, you do it once and it helps 1 billion. And so that's where we're really trying to dive in this concept of leverage and what we mean by that. One of the places where we got, and I'm bringing you up, maybe not in the way that you're going to like, a lot of the ways that we had of people saying where we don't do that. Right? Greg Rashley, one of the other co-chairs, said, Jay, we're telling people to do the things that pay off and don't do the things that don't pay off. Where's the wisdom in that? And we said but we don't always do that. A lot of times in compliance and regulation, we don't do that, right? You have to do the compliance checklist, and it might take you 100 hours to do it, but it's not going to take the bad guys 100 hours to bypass it. Now, I know we've been trying to do much better in this and taking away headwinds and doing other things on the regulatory and other sides. And maybe, Katheryn, you can walk us through what your review on the report was.
Sure. So I had mentioned coming to this conversation in 2012, and coming into this conversation and looking back at the work we did of this landscape of 50 years, some of the things I took as givens were actually what we would deem as innovations. A chief information security officer of 17 years here to my left was actually an innovation in the sense that we created the C-suite role that was important and brought accountability and focus to the argument. Other things that were in place, we were already talking about cyber as an operational risk, and we were putting a discipline around it so that you at least had some place to go with this. But we found that this DDoS attack was a bit of a clarion call, at least from the policymaker's seat, that we had more innovation to do and more work to do. So I'd say that the goals there were to be to provide more protection, but also to protect consumers. And if you'll remember, a lot of the breaches that we had early on in the 2000 teens, where we were around personal identifiable information and target breach, et cetera. So a lot of the work that we did was really steeped in information sharing. And sometimes information sharing sounds really ho-hum and, oh yay, we're gonna share information. But very, very critical in terms of opening up our viewpoint to be able to give us greater advantage in the defense. Because here we are not only sharing information, at least from the financial services sector, amongst each other, but we are also sharing information with the government in, I think, a much more concerted way, making attempts to declassify information more readily, give security clearances to folks in industry, and take steps that at their time seemed frustratingly slow and small, but I think on the whole really were great innovations.
Yeah, and two bits that I'd like to pull out of that, because especially you talked about, that Phil had been a CISO, right? And that was one of those that was in our center pillar of that chart. so many of us, when we're thinking about innovations, we tend to be thinking about the technological innovations, right? The IDSs and firewalls and the rest. And we overlook the operational, the organizational, the process innovations, right? In 1995, after Citibank got hit, we had to create the idea of a CISO, of one person that was in charge. We had in 1988 to create the idea of a CERT, right? There wasn't a group of people that were going to be in charge when a bad thing happened and to prep for it beforehand and to reduce vulnerability. We had to invent that. In 1998, we had to invent the idea of ISACs, the cyber kill chain, right? Think about the leverage we get from that. It doesn't cost anything. It's an idea. It's a doctrine. And so we really wanted, as part of this, and talking about what you had mentioned, and things like information sharing. It started from a policy, then it became an organization, moved on. And I want to ask you both about cloud, because I know it really struck me when I was in Washington, D.C., everyone would say, well, the cloud is great, but. And it would always then finish with a but. And it really surprised me in the New York Cyber Task Force, the conversation would go, well, the cloud is great, and would carry on. And Phil, maybe you can start with that, and then Katheryn, you've been doing a ton on this.
Yeah, look, I think most people in this room, if not all people in this room, will probably agree with this notion that unless you have an extremely large technology team and an extremely skilled cybersecurity team, you're not really going to outscale what you could get with an appropriate use of something at one of the large cloud services providers. And again, I'm not looking at the world through purely rose-tinted glasses. I know there's plenty of issues still in certain aspects of cloud services, and like anything in life, you can make an incorrect use of it and still shoot yourself in the foot. But generally speaking, if you're approaching this really well, you're going to get more ability to protect your services within those services than you could probably ever afford and could scale yourself. But I think the thing that came out from all of us in the task force was when you look at the forward, and this is back to the leverage point, when you look at the extent of innovation that's going on in the major cloud service providers, you just look at you look at some of the Amazon events and the Google events where they're announcing hundreds, if not thousands, of innovations on improving security, configuration management, resiliency across all of their product suites. And you think, how can you tap in to that growth of innovation to protect your own information, your own services? And that's an example of where we should be hooking into leverage to get that level of protection and to get the ability to share and tap into a community that is constantly innovating. You could do that yourself. The question is, I think most companies have to be honest whether they can really invest and scale that themselves to the extent that you could do that by partnering with one of the major cloud providers. Again, not to say that that's a panacea, not to say that everybody shouldn't still have some degree of their own infrastructure depending on the nature of your enterprise, but to somehow decide not to do that, I think the task force was pretty strong in its conclusion that had been misguided.
Yeah, I mean, Ed Amoroso was really pushing it. I mean, a real cloud evangelist. I was just waiting for everyone to jump on him and point out all the errors, and nobody did. They just kept reinforcing the idea.
Sure, I'll name the but. Instead, the task force talked about the and, but I'll name one of the buts. I have a group of students that are about to release their own paper at Columbia CIPA who look closely at cloud computing as a transmission channel for cyber risk and an event that could create a financial instability moment, so a moment for the entire system to crash. And so we have these wonders, and Phil spoke to them about what are the efficiencies, where this massive scale, where it really fits our definition of innovation. The but is concentration risk. And if you have one cloud provider, it's 50% of the revenue in the market. You have the largest banks in the country, i.e. world, hooking up to the same cloud provider. How do you do that in a safe way? How do you do that in a way that doesn't provide the attacker one single point of failure, in a sense, that could actually have ripple effects into our entire financial system? So it's been a really interesting study to look at cloud computing from that perspective, in the sense that naming this innovation, headwinds present themselves even as we're adopting cloud.
So really bringing down our enterprise IT risk, but it is at risk of additional concentration in vendor risk.
That's it, right. Yeah. So it's really how you adopt the cloud in your own enterprise, how you think about it from a systemic perspective.
Great, and I'll start looking around for questions. If you want to catch my eye on, we'll go to questions a little bit earlier than planned. Any other innovations that really caught your eye, or things that we were going through?
Well, it's interesting just to build
or any surprises.
Well, just to build on what you were saying is I think we have a tendency in this space, or at least we have in past years, to focus on the technical innovations and to think it's going to be the next engineering innovation or the next product that is going to be the next best thing that's going to help us get that leverage. And what was really interesting in the task force, just to build on some of the things that Jay was saying, is just really starting to treat process and other types of innovations that aren't necessarily engineering innovations as being first-class citizens alongside the engineering. So they again, information sharing analysis centers or ISAOs or other equivalent information sharing. Again, I'm fully aware of the imperfections in the model of information sharing, but when you actually look at the success that's been achieved in many sectors, the ability to share information about what attacks are occurring so a community can take preventative or responsive steps to that, again, goes back to adjusting the economics of attackers. So attackers have to think about the digital bullet they're going to spend that they may not get to spend again if it's detected and percolated across a community. Again, by no means perfect, but it's certainly a massive improvement from when there was no sharing. And that's an example of where there was some engineering innovations behind that, but most of it is just an idea, a lot like you see in other aspects of industry and other aspects of technology where things like agile, things like DevOps, things like site reliability engineering are all concepts that improve things, that then tools come to support that. And so I think we've got to keep kicking ourselves to think about process innovation and approaches and doctrines of doing things as being a first-class object alongside engineering innovations.
Yeah.
I'll add another one. My favorite is the NIST framework, which was a collaboration of government and industry. And it is industry agnostic, technology agnostic, maturity agnostic, in the sense that it lays a framework for how to think about an enterprise cybersecurity approach. And for the financial services industry, the largest banks are more mature in most cases of where the NIST framework is focusing. But we have 6,000 banks, we have 5,000 credit unions, we have insurers, we have broker-dealers, et cetera, and then including all the other industry sectors. So this is really something that has been put on paper to really help raise the cybersecurity hygiene of industry and then allow you to evolve as it goes. And importantly, the NIST framework was just updated. So it too is evolving, which is something that we speak to in the task force paper. You know, something that can breathe as a living doctrine, can adapt to technology and mature. They updated it, NIST 1.1, and one of the focuses is supply chain. A really explicit look at supply chain and how do you think about those third, fourth, and even fifth party risks.
And it's not being picked up not just by U.S. regulators, by
global. That's right. It's become really the baseline of many global frameworks, G20, G7, to particularized adoption at different country levels.
And one of the things that really caught me as we were going through and working on the task force report is, and I wish I could have renamed it. I don't think I would have named it transparency again, because we said where we can really get a lot of this leverage that we wanted, you know, the most advantage to the defender at the greatest scale and the least cost, is through transparency. And the example that we gave was, well, right now, Consumer Reports is trying to work their way through thinking about cybersecurity so that if you're looking on an electronic device on Consumer Reports, it's going to have a cybersecurity rating, right? That's going to be tough for them to get right. But boy, just think about the market incentives that are going to change if you're producing a device and now you're going to be rated by Consumer Reports on the security on that, right? You want the full donut, right? You don't want the half donut from Consumer Reports. And no matter how much work it would take for Congress or for the US government to try and agree on what those standards are going to be, Consumer Reports can do it and we can change the entire market. And we thought of other examples like this, and Phil, I'd heard when we were briefing this to DHS and you jumping in on some of the BitSight security scorecards and how you've been using that and kind of your vendor, and maybe you talk about that.
Yeah, so I think, again, a lot of you will be familiar with these. There's various companies, BitSight, Risk Recon, FICO, Security Scorecard. Again, and caveat these things heavily that if you only were to rely on those scorecards and not do other due diligence, you'd probably do yourself a disservice. But these scorecards are an incredibly important data point to look to see if your own assessment of your supply chain is matching what you get from these rating services. But interestingly, again, addressing the market dynamic point, the rating services are used by many of all of our customers. And when they don't have the staff to do more comprehensive assessments, they're going to these rating services. And so, like it or not, these rating services are serving a useful utility. And so many of us are partnering with those organizations to make sure that the ratings are as reliable as they possibly can be. One of the things we also did was with the US Chamber of Commerce, introduced in partnership with these ratings companies a set of standards for how the ratings should operate. So the fact that there should be a right to dispute your rating, the fact that you should be able to see your rating and even when you're not a customer of that rating service. And all of these companies responded quite well to that because it's in our interest to make sure that those ratings are as useful as possible and are as close as possible, or at least directionally indicative to represent the security of what they're reporting on. And again, the behavior change in many parts of the market when they see their score is a positive incentive to improve their score. Again, that's another innovation that I think when done well can be tremendously powerful.
And again, if anyone has any questions, we've got a mic that will come around and love to hear your thoughts on this. And it was another one of the transparency examples that I liked. I see Josh Kerman here, and he gave a lot of ideas from the Atlantic Council as well as Bo Woods. And Bo Woods would carry around a packet of Twinkies. I mean, delicious snack cake, sure, but I was always like, man, why do you have Twinkies? And he said, because I know, Bo would say that he handles cybersecurity at hospitals. And yet he knows more about what's in this packet of Twinkies because it has a nutrition label on it. And he doesn't know the exact recipe, but he knows the ingredients in the order that they're in there. He knows the sugar, the fat, the other content. And yet is running critical infrastructure like hospitals. When he gets software, he has no idea what libraries are used in that. Hey, you're using struts. Go, bet you didn't know that. And wouldn't it be nice to have a software bill of materials or a nutrition label like that? And Commerce has now been picking up that idea, and we've heard DHS has been picking up these ideas. And so as we're looking, we've got this New York, going to be a lot of finance. Are there any other ideas that you were thinking about as you're talking about this? Back with Treasury and with DC. What's your top kind of asks on this?
I'd love to see a cyber insurance market that actually can insure against cyber events. I think that would be fabulous.
What are we missing for?
There's no standardization of peril or contract or how peril works. There's a question if we should be treating a cyber event in a backstop fashion like we do terrorism risk insurance, if that would be the kind of nudge that the market needs to be able to take on more risk. So I think it's a very difficult challenge. I mean, that's a perfect place to align market incentives. You can actually use insurance as a way to increase cyber hygiene within an enterprise, but we're not there yet. I think I'm going back a few years. I think premium was $1 billion. We're now up in multi-billions, but slow.
Yeah, but that's still nothing on the.
No, I mean it was. If you talk to some of the larger financial institutions, at some points, $300 million of coverage was the most they could do. And I spoke to a CEO of a top 10 bank in the U.S. who said, "I'm 300 I can cover. I'm worried about the multi-billion-dollar event that wipes me out that I don't understand."
Are the reinsurers yet?
Growing.
Yeah, and Phil, I'm going to come back to you. And Phil, I'm going to come back to you in a little bit and talk about board, because to me that's been one of the big process innovations.
Of course, it's not a question, but
yeah,
tying together the
can you say who you?
Josh Corman, the aforementioned. The software bill of materials thing is interesting for both purposes, right? The transparency to know, am I affected? Where am I affected? How do I take remediation steps? But also for insurance. I think the three of you up there have talked to me about this, but for the rest of us, if we do see software liability, and there's a law professor, Andrea Matwishin, who's about to publish a legal brief called the Internet of Bodies, which is probably the most full-throated argument for the introduction of some form of liability. Part of the insurance chicken before the egg kind of thing is, and part of the liability problem is what counts as reasonable care or due care, or what you can't be responsible for all harm caused by software. So the 30-second version of what people are thinking about is maybe you're not responsible for harm caused by 0 days, but you're absolutely responsible for harm caused by known vulnerabilities, those two words. And the key being, if you publish a software bill of materials and it's clear what known vulnerabilities you're transferring or accepting, then maybe that's all you're really responsible for. And that allows you to do t-shirt sizes of small, medium, large, extra large for some of the insurance premiums.
Yeah, and it was interesting, I'll touch on software liability, and I don't know if either of you want to touch on that, but I'll also mention, we included these as, and Gus, over here, and it was interesting we included some of these as, we knew they were definitely going to be providing leverage, right? We said we wanted leverage, and we said, boy, software liability is going to do that. Holding ISPs responsible for not passing the trash will do that. Active defense, going back and interfering with the folks that are messing with us, can do that. But we sat back and we said, boy, it's really tough to know, is this going to, as my colleague Michael Solomar at Harvard says, we know a lot of the solutions, we just don't know at the end of the day who pays. And a lot of these, like software liability, who pays, how is that going to affect the economics, and how is that going to affect innovation, a lot of those others. So we mentioned that those were certainly ideas with leverage, but we didn't really, we didn't recommend them because at the end of the day, we didn't want to get into the who pays. I don't know if either of you want to.
Yeah, hi. I have actually a twofold question.
Do you mind introducing yourself? You don't have to.
Yeah, sure. Sorry. I'm Anand Deval, and I have 15 years experience in enterprise IT service management. Mm-hmm. And just this morning, I presented a paper on cyber incident data analysis and repository, an initiative from the DHS, mm-hmm. and the implications of actually making cyber insurance as a premise for an initiative that thrives on data. And the latest executive order from the new government has no reference to CDR. But that's the introduction part, but my question really is, number one, can cyber insurance really be the premise for enabling or improving security postures within the enterprise? And second, why is there no traction, in your opinion, on the legal framework to support cybersecurity and build awareness? Thank you.
So I'll take a shot at the first bit on insurance. So I think again, I think you've got to have other reasons for buying cybersecurity insurance. I don't think in and of itself acts to cause improvements. I think but once you've decided for other reasons to buy cybersecurity insurance, then the implementation of higher controls and demonstrating that can reduce the cost of that insurance, because it would generally bring your premiums down, just like other forms of risk mitigation would reduce your potential risk transfer, and therefore it should bring your premiums down. But I think you've got to have another reason for buying the insurance to then use it to use control to drive down the cost of that insurance is one way of looking at it.
On your second question, I just want to clarify legal framework in regards to federal, state.
And also on insurance. I mean, so you oversaw the Federal Insurance Office, if I remember my biography correctly. So, and it really struck me because we've been saying at the federal level that insurance is going to come save the day. Like, once we get insurance right, it is going to align these incentives. And we've been saying that for like a decade now, right? I mean, AIG was selling products 15 years ago, almost 20 years ago now.
I'm hopeful, as I first said, I hope. I do empathize, though, with the question of how do you create an actuarial table around cyber events and how to ensure cyber, given the data. And does the last attack have future projections for the next. So I empathize with that,
Yeah.
and where you get to.
And a lot of the conversations we've had is too many of the insurance companies are still pricing around revenue rather than risk, or at least the last I'd heard, right? Oh, let's say you're $1 billion company, about this many people. Here's how the pricing is going to be. Now I'm curious. I'd like to pull on this a little bit, because insurance is one way that you can hold companies accountable. I mean, insurance, you've got to meet a standard. I'd like to touch on both board governance as well as mergers and acquisitions. I remember the Linklaters a couple years ago had a survey where they asked M&A deal makers, do you think you need to, how important is cybersecurity in valuing this deal and doing your due diligence? And like 2/3 of these lawyers and bankers are like, oh yeah, really important. And then how many of you actually did that in your recent deals? And it was like 1/3 of them actually bothered to do what they thought was important to make sure that the intellectual property hadn't walked out the door. And that strikes me as one of the some of these real areas with board governance and M&A. And so curious your thoughts on either of these issues.
Yeah, like I think, just generalizing, not just about M&A, but I think in this day and age, any significant business transaction, whether it's new product innovation, acquisition, other types of partnership arrangement, I think, especially if it's a critical part of the business and has a significant amount of information and information processing, and we all know that's pretty much everything, should have that part of diligence as part of it. And I think most companies do that today. Now, the second part of the question is that being done effectively, and it's back to the transparency point, can you get enough transparency in that process? And of course, that's leveraged by the effort you would put into it.
Mm-hmm.
On board governance, I'll say, we make a comment in the task force that this should be about top down, not technology up. And I think that has been an innovation, is the accountability that's coming through the regulatory framework, whether that's from the banking regulators who say that boards need to be accountable for these types of operational risks, or from the SEC who says boards have to be accountable for disclosure for incidents. So we have a few different places, at least in the financial services sector, where regulators have said boards must behave in the following way to try to spread the hygiene from the top down. How effective that is, you can question, but that is, as written, it is there.
Yeah. I've always said, tongue in cheek, if I could convince one person in the world to take cybersecurity seriously, it wouldn't be the President of the United States. It would be Warren Buffett, right? If you could get him to say, I'm going to use the NIST cybersecurity framework in all my companies, and I'm only buying companies that I know the intellectual property hasn't walked out the door, every business newspaper in the world is going to be covering that, and every board member in the world is then going to be saying, what the hell is in this cybersecurity framework, right? But that's where we can get leverage in trying to get to that place. Yep. Sorry, was there a, yeah, of course. Okay, you got 1, 2, and then 3. I'm going to take all 3 questions because I'm starting to get the hand from Gus, so.
I love your use of analogies and where else you see leverage is working, then applying that to cybersecurity. So for cyber insurance and what's really holding it back, can we apply any analogies there? So one item that came to mind for me was something I heard from John Stewart share once about the UL, or the Underwriters Laboratories. Are you familiar with that? So the UL, you see on any electrical device, and that came into play because of the fire insurance. To give out fire insurance policies, they needed some type of standard. Do you see any analogies there that we can apply to cybersecurity to help mature that market?
Okay, let's hold that, and I'll take the other 2 questions. One here, and then over here. Thank you.
Oh yeah, my question's pretty similar. I mean, if I have a house, I want to insure it against fire. There's certain standards I have to meet. I have to have a fire detector. I have to have X, Y, and Z. If I want car insurance, they can pull the black box from the car to see what happened in the accident. Mm-hmm. Are the insurance companies going to go to Goldman Sachs, analyze them? Going to go to Citigroup, analyze them? Going to go to local community bank and analyze them? At what point does insurance I don't see how it's feasible. And also, what happens if Goldman Sachs sorry, but you're Goldman Sachs, so what happens if Goldman Sachs deploys a new application? Does the insurance company have to test that application again? At what point is it feasible that insurance doesn't? I don't see how it is going to happen. Sorry.
Great. Thank you. And over here, we'll take the
Isn't it
last
just
question.
say no?
Yeah. and then we'll do a wrap up and answer these.
Actually, I just want to add value to your point. My name is Joseph So. I actually work for a reinsurance company. To your point, the insurance company, believe it or not, are actually looking at the underwriting policies when you're submitting for cybersecurity insurance. So we're going to ask for things like your cybersecurity policies, what type of controls you have in place. Are you doing an annual pen test per year? Are you doing cybersecurity training per year? So these things help us factor in our policy as we provide back to you afterwards. So to your point, yes, we are starting to look at these things. The insurance companies in particular are actually starting to partner up right now with security control vendors, like such as Cisco, Apple, for instance, right? So if they're saying is, if you have these security controls, we're going to lower your insurance premiums going forward. So they are starting to partner up. So what this is doing as a cybersecurity as a whole, as a community right now, is we're improving the posture because of the insurance policies, because now you're enforcing the companies to buy certain security products to improve the overall security posture.
And that's what we're aiming for. Okay, and then last here. Thanks.
Hi, I'm not talking about insurance.
Okay.
But when you
Aw.
spoke about Mr. Buffett, you spoke about if he invested in companies, it would create leverage for a direction that you want to go to. Well, our high school and college children, untapped probably for the most part of great talent in math and logic. Why not create rewards for them for excelling from the corporations, excelling in computer science and in innovations? And if they do find a bug, what do you call it when you reward somebody?
Bounty.
Don't call it a bounty. That's very negative. You call a lottery, so call it appreciation.
Yep.
Our ideas are attached to what we say.
Yep.
So
I like it. And let
make
me
it very strong.
Okay, sounds good. And we've got a range of things there on.
So it's back to the question. It's back to the transparency point. I mean, I think the insurance companies, in fact, anybody working to manage mutual liability would like more transparency. And in fact, it's interesting, you see many of the insurance companies utilizing many of these security ratings companies. Again, not to say that they're a perfect representation, but you can see clearly the demand there to get this type of information. On the subject of, I think a lot of major companies were sponsoring hackathons, we're sponsoring things at university, high school levels.
Chase the name down, not hackathon.
No. So I use that as what it's called today. I agree with you. I agree with you that we need to make sure that we're figuring out names for things that are more inclusive and are going to attract more people to this.
And if you haven't seen what SANS is doing in their Cyber Start program, I think it's exactly what you're talking about here, where they're bringing in and they're starting to aim the program with girls, but it's coming in and it's games. And you hear Alan Paller, and he's talking with one of these, not even a teenage girl, like 12, and saying, well, how did you learn to program Unix? And as he describes it, she looks at him with the duh look of like, it's in the game. Of course I learned how to do Unix, right? And I think that's exactly in the line of what you're thinking for. Katheryn?
Anything to add?
Well, I am curious. I
appreciate the comments from the cyber insurance perspective.
And I do want to touch one on the insurance, because we've got a couple different models of insurance, right? Life and fire insurance happen at a pace where you kind of know when it's going to happen, so you can have an actuarial model, right? You know about the rate that people are going to die off. You're not going to get all of a sudden an extra billion claims on that, because the risks generally aren't correlated. In our space, some but not all of the risks are correlated. You're hit with Mirai, not Petya, and you know you're going to have to pay off a whopping load of these all at once instead of just a little bit at a time. And I don't know if you have any thoughts. I mean, insurance happens at the state. Is there a federal role in trying to bring those models together?
I mentioned this potential backstop idea that I've seen floated and folks are rather passionate about, to provide for the event. Now, granted, the way it's written, terrorism risk insurance is written, you have to prove an event of terror before you can hit the backstop, and premium has to be exhausted, or I should say payout has to be exhausted in the insurance industry before you get there. But there could be a mechanism, especially if we think about how do we get insurance from a nation-state action. if we have a nation-state action that is so severe that takes systems down, who's liable for that? Yeah. So you could imagine there being some fit within TRIA.
Okay. The terrorism risk insurance. Yep. And just to close on the any final point before I close? Okay. Also on the United Laboratories and the UL model, which I really like. We've been talking about it for 20 years. To me, that's the Consumer Reports is starting to go down that path. Mudge and Sarah Zatko were working on their cyber independent testing labs. I don't know if whatever came of that, but they were really starting to do this good, repeatable work so that you could have some kind of an independent, verifiable rating based on engineering. And I really like that model, and I do hope that we see it. So I've got a few copies of the New York Cyber Task Force up here. So please, we'll join our fantastic, brilliant panel. I'll see you.